What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Steve.
I'm Lindsay.
Today we're going to be reading to Rugby Explained for American football fans. Now, I wouldn't say I'm a huge American football fan. It's a sport I watch from time to time, generally college football, but mostly I'm a basketball fan. But that said, I felt like this would probably be a good explanation for us, considering we are familiar with American football. And so hopefully we will be able to grasp the ins and outs of what's being explained, since we are somewhat familiar with American football.
Right.
Because I do know that rugby is pretty similar to American football in some ways.
I've
But
never seen anything about rugby. Like,
Never?
No, maybe like a clip here or there. I've just heard it's very brutal, I guess you would say. Like, very more hands-on than American football.
Yes, I would say, based off the tiny little bit I've seen about rugby, that is definitely a bit more brutal, which I think would be more interesting to watch. Yeah, so guys, I guess we'll just go ahead and jump in here and check out Rugby Explained for American football fans.
I'm excited. I've been wanting to look at rugby.
All right. To get things started, I want you to picture one of those wild plays at the end of some football games when there's no time left on the clock and the team with the ball needs to score a touchdown. So it's basically a mad scramble with a bunch of laterals and backward tosses, with the hope that by doing this, they will eventually be able to break through the defense and score. You're watching some now, so it shouldn't be too hard to picture this. Now, imagine a game where every play is like this. So in our imaginary game, every play is this type of desperate, mad scramble. In this game, there are no forward passes. And in fact, a player on offense is not even allowed to fumble the ball forward or knock it forward.
I forgot about that. Yeah, from what I understand, you can only do like backwards or like lateral passes.
That's kind of hard to wrap my mind around.
I know, it is.
So you like throw it behind you? Or
Right,
you
like
turn around?
Yeah, no, like
What? You can't look?
I don't know if you can like look. I think you can probably look, but I don't think you can like just pass it forward.
Did you hear him say you can't even fumble it forward? Like,
Right.
by accident?
Right.
That's crazy. I wonder what happens if you do.
I
You
don't
lose
know.
yardage or something?
I'm not sure.
Accidentally. In this game that we're imagining, play doesn't stop when a player is tackled. The player just gets the ball to a teammate and
Oh
the
my
scramble
gosh.
continues. In this game, in order to score a touchdown, you actually have to touch the ball down on the ground in the end zone. And finally, imagine that no one in this game is wearing helmets or pads or anything like that. If you can visualize what this imaginary game might be like, you are well on your way to understanding rugby. In fact, rugby and American football more or less descend from the same game, which explains their many similarities.
So, what happened to American football? Why all of a sudden did they decide to put on not just helmets, but all sorts of padding as well? You know, if it basically was birthed from rugby.
Yeah, and it's way more... Rugby is way more hands-on. Like, the game never stops, it sounds like. So even if you're tackled, you don't get like a timeout to regroup or...
As someone who's never actually watched a game, it seems like rugby would be more fast-paced.
Yeah, which I would enjoy, because that's one of the things I don't like about American football.
Yes.
Is it's constantly stopping and constantly taking breaks.
It's literally like you might get 10 seconds of action and then you're stopping. If that. Yeah. Probably not even that. Like, it's just... And then it takes a while for everybody to set back up, and it's just so slow.
Yeah, it's really drawn out.
And I love the fact they go out here with none of the safety equipment.
I hope they tell us how long the games are compared to...
We'll get to the history of all of this later in the video. If you want to understand rugby, the first thing to know is that there are actually two distinct versions or codes of rugby. And these games are different enough from one another that they are usually considered to be two distinct sports. The older and more widely played version or code of rugby is officially called Rugby Union. And Rugby Union will be blue for the purposes of this video. The slightly, but only slightly, newer code is called Rugby League official.
Okay, I've heard these two terms, and I wasn't quite understanding before what the difference was.
So it's just two different variations.
Two completely different versions in some way of rugby itself.
And this is the dominant version of rugby in Australia, especially on the East Coast, in Northern England, and in certain Pacific Island nations, including Papua New Guinea, where it's the national sport. Rugby League will be yellow for this video.
But Rugby Union is the older one.
Generally goes by the simple name rugby when it's being played. And sometimes they use the even more generic term football. So it's important to know which version of rugby you're watching.
Wait, which one goes by football? Or both of them? I think you should talk about both of them.
Yeah, sometimes in general.
That's wild. So obviously,
but you can tell by the uniforms.
No, I understand
Blues,
that.
Union, yellows.
But I'm saying, like, they call it football some places, and around the world, obviously, what we know as soccer here in the U.S. is called football.
That's true.
So yeah, that would be a little bit confusion if you're just basically telling, did you see that football game?
Yeah.
But
because again, they are different enough from one another that they are essentially different sports. Now, in the United States, the predominant form of rugby is rugby union. And this is the game that most people are referring to when they just say rugby. And again,
I've never known anyone that played rugby here in the U.S. I've never seen.
I don't think I have.
I've never
Any school I've ever been to hasn't had rugby.
It hasn't.
Although, I don't know if IU does or not.
Yeah, like any school I ever went to didn't have rugby either. Like, it's just something that's so foreign to me. It's a sport that I know very little about other than the couple of videos I checked out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is also the case internationally for the most part. Rugby league is much less common in the United States. In fact, Wikipedia says that there are only about 700 registered players in the U.S. However, international rugby league matches are shown regularly in the U.S. by at least one cable network, Fox Soccer Plus. So for some people in the United States, rugby league might be the only version of rugby that they have available to them.
We've never had cable, really.
Because of this, and because I know this channel has an international following, and also because like you might go to Australia and want to watch rugby and need to know what's going on, we're going to be covering both versions of rugby in this video. We will get to what makes each version of rugby unique later in the video. Let's begin with a general overview that applies to both games.
General overview.
Rugby, in general, is a contact sport played without pads or helmets, contested between two teams of either 13 or 15 players, depending on the version of rugby. There are 7-a-side and 9-a-side versions of rugby. These are shorter and faster-paced versions of the game that are often played at festivals. Rugby is played on a field that is 100 meters long and at least 68 meters wide.
Okay, so
isn't football 50 yards?
100 yards for a football field.
Is it?
Yeah. So it's slightly larger or longer than a football field.
So that's 109 yards long and at least 74 yards wide. The field has markings at various points. And
the rugby league field looks more like a football field.
These markings do have some significance within each game, but on the most basic level, the markings on the field are your best clue as to whether you're watching rugby union or rugby league. Regardless of the version of rugby being played, the center line on the field is called the halfway line, and the goal lines are called the try lines. At each end of the field is an in-goal area, which is what we would call the end zone. The in-goal areas have a set of uprights that are called goals, and the out-of-bounds area is called touch. So where we would say the ball went out of bounds, they would say it went into touch, or that it's in touch. A rugby match begins similarly to an American football game. There is a coin toss to determine who kicks off, and the team that receives the kickoff attempts to move the ball down the field to score, while the team that kicked off tries to stop them. The team with possession of the oval-shaped ball is allowed to move it by running with it, kicking it, or tossing it laterally or backwards. Forward passes are not allowed, and an offensive team is not even permitted to play a ball that has been knocked or...
It said that pass was a forward pass?
Mm-hmm. And that the game...
Play was stopped. Okay, so that was... I want to see that again. See what they meant by a forward pass.
Forward passes are not allowed, and
it was just...
team is not even permitted to play a ball...
It was just to a guy that was slightly ahead of them.
Well, he wasn't really. He was running.
Yeah, but when he caught it, he was ahead of where the other person was. I guess that's...
I feel like this would be really hard to keep up with. For me, it's hard to tell.
Or fumbled forward, even if the knock or the fumble was unintentional. Forward. You are allowed to punt the ball forward. The punt is often used to clear the ball out, similar to the purpose of the punt in American football.
Dang.
But the punt is also used offensively in
so
rugby,
you can't move it forward, you just got to punt it.
The forward pass in American
football.
football.
No wonder they got big legs.
Just like in American football, defenders are allowed to make contact with and tackle the ball carrier. Once the ball carrier has been brought
Except they don't have helmets.
The tackling defender is required to release the tackle, and the ball carrier is required to give up the ball, which usually involves getting it to a teammate to continue play. The rules governing exactly what happens after a tackle has been made differ depending on which version of rugby is being played, and this is the biggest difference between the two codes of rugby. So we're going to be looking at this topic of what happens after a tackle in its own section later in the video. All right, let's talk about scoring. The objective in rugby is to score points, either by kicking the ball through the uprights, which is called a field goal, or by bringing the ball past the try line and touching it to the ground, which is called a try and is very similar to a touchdown.
So in American football, you can obviously run it into the end zone. You don't have to actually touch it to the ground, and it counts as a touchdown. But with both of these, with the Rugby Union and Rugby League, you have to actually touch it to the ground, and basically you get 4 points or 5 points depending on which version it is.
Okay. Just like the touchdown in American football, a try is worth more than a field goal. And after a team has scored a try, they get a free kick at the goalposts, which is called a conversion. A team can also score points via penalty kicks, which are uncontested kicks at the uprights that happen after penalties, similar to foul shots in basketball. The number of points earned by all of these things differs depending on which version of rugby.
Oh, wow, okay.
After points are scored, the team that got scored on kicks off to the team who just scored. So yeah, they go hard. A rugby player is only allowed to make a play on the ball or influence the game if they are onside. During play, being onside generally means being behind the ball from your perspective. Being offside itself is not a penalty, but it becomes a penalty when an offside player attempts to make a play on the ball or interferes with the game. There are some more specific rules governing offside, including for some set pieces, and those are outside of the scope of this video. Let's talk about that ball real quick. The rugby ball is the same length as an American football, but it is a bit wider and has rounded ends. This makes it a lot less aerodynamic, of course, but that doesn't matter because you're not throwing the ball forward in rugby.
We actually got sent a rugby ball.
Yes, it's right over there,
Thank
actually.
you, Dan.
We had to go grab our lucky rugby ball.
And they're just, like, we finally got it aired up, and they're so massive. Like, I literally couldn't even hold it.
Yeah,
like,
they are so much different than a football.
An American football.
It's kind of crazy, honestly, how large the thing is. But
so I can see why you couldn't throw it forward, because I wouldn't be able to.
Not like that, yeah. Not like a football, American football.
There's no way I could play rugby because I can't hold the ball.
In rugby, the play rarely stops except for a few specific reasons. These include, number one, if scoring has happened. Number two, if the ball is moved forward by an offensive player by any means except for carrying it or kicking it. Number three, if the ball goes into touch. Number four, if there's a penalty. And number five, if there's an injury.
So why would someone ever pass it forward if you know that you're...
Well, it's probably an accident.
Yeah, I guess.
You're not doing it on
maybe you're passing it... You're trying to pass it very laterally, and it just happens to go slightly forward when you pass it or something.
Otherwise, play pretty much keeps going. So in this sense, it's a much more kinetic game than American football.
Yes.
When play restarts after being stopped, it is generally restarted via something called a set piece. If you play soccer, you're familiar with set pieces. The main set pieces in Rugby Union
Wait, hold on.
Which looks like this. It is how play is restarted when the ball goes into touch. And this.
Wait, so they like lift them up in the air? Is that what I'm seeing?
To get the interception or something? I don't know.
Okay, that's interesting. So, all right. I've never seen anything quite like that. All right. I love how this seems to go so much faster. It's not just this, like American football could literally, a game could be half the time.
Yeah.
If they didn't take so long between plays.
I feel like with rugby, though, at least for a while, I would have no clue what was happening because it's so fast paced. I'd just be like, wait, what?
Well, and even hearing this explanation, it's like, okay, yeah, I am definitely not going to retain everything I'm learning here. There's no way. There's so many different things.
You definitely, in a game like rugby, can't go to the restroom during the game or like the concession because...
No, you're going to miss a lot, it sounds like.
Scrum, which looks like this, and is how play is restarted after certain minor infractions or when the ball becomes unplayable but stays in bounds.
What the
scrum
heck?
is intensely physical in Rugby Union, and there are strict and specific rules governing the scrum. In Rugby League, the scrum is the only set piece, so it's how play is restarted anytime it needs to be restarted.
What in
unlike
the world?
The scrum in Rugby Union, the Rugby League scrum is more of a formation than a physical contest. and the team that is awarded a scrum almost always gets possession of the ball. Compare these.
Okay, I'm sitting here trying to figure out what they were doing.
Point was?
What they were doing to get the ball. Like, were they
their feet?
They were kicking with their feet backwards to their open person?
I don't know.
I don't know what you would call the guy who's back there open, waiting for the ball, right? Like, that's what it looked like to me. It looked like they were trying to press the other team forward, and then so they would have the ball closer out this way and then kick it back. That's what it looked like. Let us know, guys, if that's what was going on there.
Rugby league scrums.
Well, they just
this rugby
rolled
union
it.
Scrum. This is
Not
another
really sure.
clue as to which version of rugby you're watching. On screen right now are some basic rugby terms and their American football equivalents. This is for you to use as a reference.
Okay.
Take a screenshot.
Okay, touchdown, try, extra point conversion,
Field goal,
field goal, touch, out of bounds, in goal area, end zone, try line, goal line, halfway line, 50-yard line. Okay.
That if you want. Beyond all this, the details of the game that you watch will depend on the version of rugby that you're watching.
Okay.
But before we get to all that, I want to do a quick history lesson so you can get a sense of why rugby and American football are as similar as they are.
A bit of history.
The easiest way to start the history portion of this video is by acknowledging that most forms of football played around the world trace their roots back to the football games played in medieval Europe, and medieval England in particular. These games belong to a wider category of game that has been played around the world throughout history, in which two groups of people, and it's usually a large number of people, compete with one another to kick, carry, and or toss a ball or other object into some sort of goal or across some sort of line or into some sort of goal area, almost always through violence. This type of game was already known by the name football in England by the 1300s, and the name football appears to have been in wide use by the 1500s. Today, these medieval games are often called mob football.
So it sounds like football, rugby, American football as in soccer, sounds like, and there's probably other ones that I'm not even thinking about, but it sounds like they all kind of originated from the same general idea.
Isn't it really interesting how for that long, like basically throughout human history, we've been doing some version of this?
Yeah.
Like,
that's kind of crazy.
Probably way more brutal back then.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Because you're playing for much higher stakes.
Yeah, I'm sure if those guys from hundreds and thousands of years ago could look in on us now, they would be like, wow, you're really soft, guys.
Rugby looks brutal, though.
Yeah, it does. It does.
To evoke the chaos and anarchy that defined them. And football was often banned by kings and within various jurisdictions due to the destruction and injury that it brought. By the 1800s, this type of game was being played in a more organized way at schools and sporting clubs throughout the English-speaking world, including the United States and Canada. Up until the mid-1800s, each school or club played by its own rules, and these rules could differ greatly. So when schools played against one another, they had to agree on the rules of each individual match. Eventually,
it's interesting that I know from what I understand that within the UK, generally speaking, college sports are not a huge thing at all. And it seems like maybe at one time, maybe college sports were a little bit bigger of a deal over there than they are now.
Standard forms of football developed, and the first one to catch on widely was a version played at the rugby school in England. This is the game that the modern forms of rugby descend from, and it was the version of football that directly inspired what we now call
the rugby
football
school
in America. McGill University in Montreal was the first North American school to base their rules on rugby rules, which had been brought to Canada by British soldiers. Harvard University's football team then learned this version of football during a series of matches between the two schools in 1874. Rugby-style football soon spread to other universities, including Princeton, Yale, Tufts, Columbia, and the University of Michigan, and quickly became the most popular form of football in the United States. In fact, for the first few decades of American football, the terms rugby and football seem to have been used interchangeably. And when we look at the rule books from the time, we see that early American football resembled rugby much more closely than what we would identify as American football today. And even though American football has evolved into its own distinct sport, there are still some vestiges
look at all the rules.
of its roots as what you could call a variation on rugby football. For example, we still call this a touchdown, even though we are long past the point where a player has to actually touch the ball down on the ground.
That's
to
true.
Score, as they do in rugby.
I had never really thought about that.
either.
Like the word touchdown, it technically you don't even have to do a touchdown to be, to score.
All right, I hope knowing that bit of history helps put everything into context. Let's go on now and talk about the most significant difference between the two codes of rugby.
The biggest difference between Rugby Union and League.
As you could tell from the general overview, the two codes of rugby share a lot in common, and the majority of their differences are easily explained. And this makes sense because up until 1895, there was only one code of rugby. The split happened because a group of teams in northern England felt that they were being overlooked by the London-based Rugby Football Union, and also because they wanted to get paid. So in 1895, that group of teams in northern England created their own governing organization, which eventually became known as the Rugby Football League. And the two codes of rugby began evolving independently of one another.
Popular among the working class in Australia due to players wanting to be paid. Just not allowed by the Southern Rugby Union.
Today, the two codes are different enough from one another that they are generally considered to be two distinct sports.
Oh,
we covered most of the differences between Rugby Union and Rugby League already, but there's one difference that to me is significant enough that I think it deserves its own section of this video, and that is what happens after a ball carrier has been tackled. This fundamental question has a dramatic effect on the strategy, gameplay, and overall flow of the action in rugby. But remember from the general overview that a tackled player in rugby is required to give up the ball, and the tackling defender is required to release the tackle. This applies to both rugby codes. What happens next is unique to each game.
I keep on seeing some people wearing some sort of helmet thing. See that? What is that thing?
I don't know. Maybe they've got some issue.
At first, I thought it was just like a do-rag or something, but then I've seen like every team seems to have one.
Or maybe it's like a certain player who wants to do like really, maybe that's the quarterback or something.
I don't know. Let us know in the comments, guys. What are we looking at here? Is that some sort of helmet? I mean, it looks like it.
It doesn't really, I mean, it's very thin.
Yeah, it is very thin, but nonetheless, there's some sort of headgear these people are wearing, and I don't know what it is.
Get into it, and we'll start with Rugby League because Rugby League operates much more like American football after a tackle. In Rugby League, which again is the one that's more popular in Australia and has the field similar to American football, each team can only maintain possession of the ball for 6 tackles. So this is similar to the 4 downs in American football, but you can think of it as 5 downs because they consider the tackle after a punt or a kickoff to be the 0 tackle. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, in Rugby League, after the ball carrier has been tackled, the defense is required to clear out at least 10 meters and allow the offense to play the ball uncontested. This is officially called the play the ball. So you can think of Rugby League as having a 10-meter neutral zone after each tackle. The exception to this are 2 defenders called the markers who are allowed to be near the ball, but they're not allowed to interfere. So I guess they're there to keep the offense honest. I don't know. Any defensive player besides the markers who has not retreated 10 meters is considered offside. So they have to get onside before they're allowed to affect the game in any way. In Rugby League, there are no first downs. So a Rugby League offense has to score before its 6th tackle, or else it gives up possession. This means that if a team is on its 6th tackle and is not close to scoring, the team will usually just punt the ball away like in American football.
Like a Hail Mary.
The difference, of course, is that the punt is a live ball in any form of rugby. So if a member of the offense catches it, they can try to score or at least push the ball as far as possible on their final tackle, as opposed to American football where a team fully gives up possession by punting. If a team does not score and gets tackled a 6th time, they become the defense and have to clear out 10 meters so that their opponents can play the ball uncontested. Real quick, because I know it will come up in the comments, I will say that there are a few ways that a team can get a fresh set of 6 tackles, and those are outside the scope of this video. All right, now we're going to talk about what happens after a tackle in Rugby Union. In Rugby Union, the ball is always live, and it's always able to be contested. So in Rugby Union, there's no concept of uncontested possession or downs, and there's no limit to the number of times an offense can be tackled while they have possession of the ball.
Okay, right off the bat, I think Rugby Union would be the one that I would like a little bit more.
Why?
It just seems like it's more fast-paced.
Well, yeah, if the ball is always live.
Right.
The ball carrier is tackled in Rugby Union, and the defender is able to get to the ball before the offense. it's a turnover, which is pretty good on the defender. Because of this possibility, there's almost always a teammate of the ball carrier ready to receive the ball after a tackle, and the defense often doesn't try to contest this handover. But it's also common for the defense and the offense to both engage over the ball after a tackle, which creates a situation called a ruck. The ruck is a vocabulary term and is an official thing in rugby. Players are required to remain on their feet during a ruck, and players can only join the ruck from the back, from their perspective. The most significant rule, maybe, is that players are not allowed to place their hands inside the ruck, which means that players need to use their feet to bring the ball to the back of the ruck, and or players need to physically push the ruck or engage with the bodies of the opposing team so that a player at the back of the ruck or from outside of the ruck can pick up the ball. Rucks are often resolved quickly, but sometimes they get extended, for lack of a better term. That's all we're going to say about the ruck in this video. There is a link in the description if you want more information. So that's the biggest difference between rugby league and rugby union, at least to my eye. And it's what gives each of these sports their own personality. Because the offense is guaranteed the ball after most tackles, the action in rugby league is more predictable and compartmentalized. And it's easy to make sense of it if you're coming at it from the perspective of an American football fan. Rugby union is more kinetic and is more of a perpetual scramble. Because the ball is essentially always live.
All right, guys. This was interesting.
It was.
I think, based off of what we learned here, I think rugby union personally looks like more my alley. Looks like something.
League isn't league. Okay, I'm getting them confused.
League is the one that's
is that the one where the ball's always live?
No, union.
Union is.
Yeah,
okay.
Rugby league is the one that's more like American football than rugby union.
Isn't rugby league the newer version?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, which I guess would make sense why that would be the one that was closer to American football since it is the newer one. But, you know, I'm personally, I wouldn't say, like I said at the beginning of this video, I'm not the hugest American football fan. I think rugby union looks a lot more fun than watching American football.
It would definitely keep my attention more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I've never been a fan of the sports that just have stoppage of play for an overly long amount of time. Yeah. I like the stuff that just like, you know, yeah, sure, you got to stop from time to time, but it picks back up and it goes, you know. Just seeing this video and learning about the different rules of rugby, I must say that there is a ton of rules. Mm-hmm. This is definitely a sport that we need to dive into a game to really, or a match, to be able to really understand all the ins and outs of it. And it's probably going to take you a few games before you really truly grasp all the main things. Yeah. You know, but this was great though.
It was, and I can definitely say it looks more brutal than any other sport that I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, any other ball sport. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like full contact, no protection.
Yeah.
Gotta be tough to play rugby.
Yeah, I like that, man. It's different. I say it's different, but it's actually what American football was born out of in some way. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. Please click that like button. Feel free to drop your comments or suggestions about this video or others. And don't forget to subscribe to continue to follow us on our journey to discover anything and everything about the UK and Ireland. Until next time, guys, peace.